Marvel Rivals finally dropped, and we have another team-based first-person shooter that looks really promising. And if you want to excel at this game from day one, you've come to the right place. My name is Spilo. I not only have many hours on playing Marvel Rivals all through the beta, including the closed beta where I had the opportunity to play both Captain America and Winter Soldier, but ironically, maybe more importantly, I have over 10,000 hours of coaching its sister game Overwatch and Overwatch 2, coaching players from the bronze rank all the way up to the Overwatch League. If you're interested in executing better in the team-based first-person shooter environment, you've come to the right place. So we'll start with that. What is a team-based first-person shooter? Well, a first-person shooter is pretty self-explanatory. You get kills and maybe you accomplish the objective along the way. But in a team-based first-person shooter, the major difference is that different roles operate in different ways. We're going to be using the tank, damage, and support archetypes basically taken from Overwatch because I think they explain the job pretty well. Tank's job is not to protect your team, but actually apply threat onto the enemy team through damage and or visible threat. The main difference between tank and damage dealers is not necessarily the amount of damage that they do, but the amount of visible presence that they have on the screen. Think of tank being the psychological damage role where they often are big and spooky, such in a way that ends up indirectly protecting your team because you force attention from the enemy team to focus on you. Some tanks in Marvel Rivals are really good at consistently applying pressure, some are inconsistent at applying pressure, but they all have the same role of, hey, look at me, don't look at my team. The damage role is essentially just to pressure, but doesn't have to always do so visibly. It can be indirect, it can be sneaky, it can be flanky, it can be from far, or it can be from up close. Damage dealers, you apply pressure, you secure kills, and you secure space. More on that later. The support or healer's job is often to support other people taking space, but in the first-person shooter and genre, for almost without exception, it's also to be able to put out pressure of your own, just finding the right balance. If you do nothing but heal and support, you're not likely to perform very well. If you do nothing but damage, you're likely to not perform all that well. It's about finding a healthy mixture of direct pressure on the enemy team and indirect pressure through supporting other members of your team. No matter tank, damage, or support, the goal of Marvel Rivals is objective-based, whether to capture points or push the objective. The key thing is how do you capture a point or how do you push the objective safely? And to do that, you need to control the space around the objective. And to do that, you generally need to secure kills. The tricky part is when I say space, I don't just necessarily mean on the objective, on the payload, or on the point itself. I often mean around the point, around the payload. A lot of times the vision, the high grounds, the off angles that have great vision onto the payload are the positions where you're going to actually be fighting. And that's often off of the payload. A great deal of Marvel Rivals, in fact, the entire point of the game is fighting the enemy / supporting teammates on locations that provide value. Positioning is really everything. Generally ranged heroes on sightlines or angles from a longer distance, closer range heroes up close, and mobility heroes utilizing their mobility to contest unorthodox space or flanks, threatening enemies from multiple different locations. Most heroes are somewhat of a hybrid. When you're starting Marvel Rivals, the best thing is to simply understand how much mobility do I have and how much range do I have with the character that I'm playing, and then practice deciding on what angle or position to take with those two variables in mind. For example, a character like Iron Man has a lot of vertical mobility, but is very slow, but he does have a lot of range. So you might take some angles or some flanks because you can fly and move around a lot, but the big strength of him is his range. So Iron Man, at least at launch, generally has a little bit less flanking flexibility, but a lot more spamming flexibility. Whereas a character like Black Panther has little to no range, but has super high mobility. So Black Panther takes a lot more aggressive flanks and looks to directly contest people up close. This also applies to tanks as well, with characters like Magneto and Doctor Strange operating more in the short to medium range, and tanks like Venom definitely leveraging their crazy mobility and extremely limited range to go for crazy flanks, and again, like Black Panther, getting up close. Also, supports, your range and mobility options are important too. Supports like Loki with built-in mobility might have more options to take and support more aggressive angles than say a support like Mantis. When you do choose your position based off of your mobility and or your range, keep in mind that you're valuing cover. The value of cover is the ability to disengage any fight that you're starting to lose or to avoid unnecessary damage. Damage is not the enemy, lethal damage is usually the enemy, and cover is generally the difference between healable damage and non-healable damage. Finally, don't forget the unique aspect of Marvel Rivals is the destructible environment actually opens up different positional opportunities that may not be there before or removes positions that were there before. More practice and more maps will get you more familiar with finding out what those positions are. To sum it up, look at where your team is taking the fight, think about what your hero's range and mobility leans into, then experiment with different positions that leverage your strengths and your weaknesses. Don't be scared to experiment. Taking risk and experimenting is an inherent part of the improvement process. class. Okay, but what about hero kits? Once I'm on that position, how do I actually use those cooldowns on my ultimate? How is honestly incredibly hero specific, and that's not what this video is going to be focusing on. If you want individual hero guides, there's going to be plenty of them out there. But the general thing to remember is, when do I use my cooldown and when do I use my ultimate? The key thing is to understand tempo, which is essentially the timing of when fight starts. When a fight starts, whether that's a poke trade from a distance or a brawl trade from up close, that's generally a good time to start thinking about using your cooldown. The key mistake to avoid is waiting until way too late in the fight to find value out of a cooldown. Most cooldowns that aren't particularly situational, the sooner that you use them in an actual trade, the better. The sooner you secure kills, the sooner you secure pressure. But the opposite mistake is even more prevalent, I find, where people will use a cooldown before the fight even starts just because they saw an enemy for a brief second. Essentially, you're looking for a commitment from either your team or the enemy team as a window for when to use your cooldown or your ultimate. A couple of examples of cooldown management going off of the kits. A character like Groot will make sure that both walls are available once the fight actually starts, not before. A character like Winter Soldier wants to make sure that he has his hook once the enemy team commits, not too soon before. And for a character like Loki, you certainly would not want to use your doppelganger teleport ability right before the fight starts unnecessarily. One thing to keep in mind for cooldowns as well is that cooldowns might change how you function with the character. Characters like Black Panther and Spider-Man are very close range, but one thing you may not consider is a character like Winter Soldier has a relatively medium range gun, but a lot of his abilities are more about getting up close. So you have a character that can poke from medium range, but when they actually want to commit, you're going to be playing up in closer ranges. Generally, your cooldowns are going to complement or add some flexibility with the different types of ranges or the different types of flanks that you might play with the character. Finally, for ultimates, one of the key concepts that we've learned from playing team-based first-person shooters like Overwatch is a concept called layering. A lot of people are very familiar with the concept of comboing ultimates, getting value by spiking two together, but one thing you might not be familiar with is taking one at a time. In other words, using one ultimate to force enemy cooldowns and enemy space, and then using the next ultimate to actually secure kills. An ultimate isn't a good ultimate just because it gets kills. A lot of the time, the first ultimate used doesn't actually secure kills because the enemy team is set up safely and already has plenty of answers for whatever you throw at them. However, the second round of pressure from that secondary ultimate is often where things lead to kills. Don't hesitate to use your ultimate first to create space for your team, as long as it's set up appropriately. And remember, if you want to get kills, using ultimates generally later in mid-fight has a higher chance of actually getting those very same kills. Just know that waiting may give the enemy team's opportunity to use those ultimates to secure that space and force your cooldowns first. It's a tricky balancing of strategy. Point being, using an ultimate without getting a kill is not necessarily a bad thing. Finally, we'll do a quick crash down on mechanics. These are just basic first-person shooter principles that are applicable to really any character at any time. First one is finding good sensitivity. Now, this is going to be for PC specifically. There is a lot of flexibility with what is a good and a bad sensitivity. The main thing that you need to know is that you need to be able to comfortably do a full 360 with your mouse pad, but honestly, not a lot more than that. Even with characters like Spider-Man and Black Panther that are going to be moving around rapidly, I find that a lot of people in first-person shooters tend to fall in the trap of having too high of a sensitivity, which means a lot of wrist aiming, which it's not just about health, it's about accuracy. I recommend for most people, you're going to be wanting to find somewhere too close to a 360 with your mouse pad or about a 540. In other words, a 360 and a half. That's going to give you some flexibility to choose what feels comfortable for you, but will allow you to have enough precision and enough movement freedom to choose what works best for you. For specific DPI and sensitivity recommendations, using Overwatch terms, I generally recommend anywhere from 3 to 8k eDPI, which is DPI times in-game sensitivity, but I honestly don't know how that extrapolates in Marvel Rivals. That's probably something for a Google search for you Overwatch fans. Next up, crosshair placement, and this one is really crucial. This is actually going to fall into my next point as well. We'll get to that one in a second, but all of good mechanics is not just muscle memory, but making the shot as easy as possible. Crosshair placement is essentially making the crosshair be closer to where the enemy team is likely to be, so that your flick and or crosshair movement is likely to be a lot smaller than it would be otherwise. Keeping your crosshair at the floor, up high, or placed inaccurately is just going to make any mechanical movement you have to do a lot harder to make. The general rule is try to keep your crosshair at head height, especially when you're turning corners, just keeping in mind that in Marvel Rivals, you might have people attacking you from multiple different verticalities. This is something that if you are new to first-person shooters, you should absolutely be training deliberately, no matter what role that you play. On a similar note, we're going to talk a little bit about tracking versus flicking. This is not going to be a very in-depth conversation about this, but the short of it is that the closer that your crosshair is to the target, the easier it is going to be to flick. Tracking is essentially following a moving target with an automatic weapon like the Punisher, flicking being more about instances of burst damage like Hela. The point being though, I see a lot of flicking mains make the mistake of trying to reset their crosshair. It doesn't matter whether you're tracking or flicking, you should almost always be tracking the target prior to your flick. A lot of people make the mistake of doing these rapid movements and then resetting the crosshair, when in reality the goal should be to track the target, make a last second adjustment when you're flicking. Track your target, make a last second adjustment. So really flicking is just tracking with a burst of focus. Remember, the goal is to track the target so that your flick is as small as possible. The smaller the flick, the more accurate you're going to be. And this is something that Overwatch pros have been abusing for absolutely years. You need to learn this skill. It deserves deliberate practice, especially for you flick mains out there. Finally, slow and smooth. And this is called trigger discipline in Overwatch. Essentially, the goal is that none of us are perfect mechanically, even the very best of us. So I find that the general habit of just holding down mouse 1 or whatever your primary fire button is just not a great habit for developing mechanical practice. Finding ways to pause mid-clip or even stop shooting for half of a second to realign your crosshair, to track the enemy's movement, to pay attention to your own movement, and then moving on from there is absolutely crucial. Slow is smooth, smooth is fast, and if you're forcing things by trying to go full out, you're not likely to improve. Accuracy comes first, speed comes second. Finally, let's talk about teamwork. It is a team game after all. I will say that this is recorded prior to roll luck. I do feel like that roll luck will eventually come. Maybe I'm wrong, but as it is now, don't flip out if you have one tank, one DPS, one support, at least. I think a lot of compositions can function with 3 DPS, 3 supports, 3 tanks. In many ways, we might discover that sustain stack is broken. Please not goats again. But the reality is, don't flame your teammates if you only have one tank or only one support. I've seen a lot of situations prior to roll lock with Overwatch where we won a lot of games despite this. I think those unorthodox compositions can function a lot more in more open maps where DPS can excel. I will say that tanks and supports become a little bit more important in more congested aspects of the map, so keep that in mind. If you are running an unorthodox composition, just focus on getting your own value in the way that your character does best. As I said earlier, too many DPS generally means that you're going to be playing more open flanks and open lanes where tanks can't quite reach you. So just be flexible, don't be toxic. Ultimately, we're all in this together. There's going to be a lot of growing pains with the community, and I think the developers are going to have to figure out different things of solving this. But in the meantime, you'll survive with suboptimal compositions, trust me. Moving off of that, communication in a team game is important, but the most important thing you can be doing to communicate in Marvel Rivals is utilizing your eyes. Where are the enemies and where are my teammates? A lot of people in Overwatch fall in the trap of communicating a lot, but not actually paying attention to what their teammates are doing. That's a trap you don't want to get into with Marvel Rivals. When you're playing DPS, tank, or support even, simply being aware of where your teammates are can drastically not only change your positioning, but how you actually use your cooldowns and ultimates from that position. I can't tell you how many times I've coached Overwatch and found a Tracer player that was taking an angle in a location to where their team wasn't even there to follow up. So no matter what hero you are, what role you are, you always need to know, where are my teammates? Can they at least capitalize off of the damage and the pressure that I'm doing? Team play doesn't necessarily mean people grouped up, but team play does mean people fighting at the same time, and you don't necessarily need a microphone to make that happen. Piggybacking off of that from team play side of things, remember that in Marvel Rivals and just team-based first-person shooters in general, angles and map control, taking different spaces around the map that complement different characters, is an incredibly important part of the game. Not just to secure kills and carry, but to actually push the objective. If you're playing Black Panther, you shouldn't be playing with your team. If you're playing Venom, you shouldn't be playing with your team. You have aspects of your kit that are deliberately there to provide value on the battlefield in unique ways. And if you're playing Venom like a frontline brawler, if you're playing Black Panther like the Punisher, you're not going to have a lot of value. And this goes for supports too. A lot of supports provide a lot of healing sustain, whereas in Marvel Rivals, there's also a lot of supports that have more utility and damage sustain. If you're not playing to your character's strengths, then you're not playing the character correct. And if you want to improve, if you want to rank up, if you want to climb, then you're going to need to use the unique aspects of your kit to climb. And that may be taking angles, that may be grouped up, that may be frontline, backline, sidelines, healing, damaging, utility. Play to your character's strengths. Finally, and this is probably the most important thing, have fun. This is going to be a very extremely imbalanced launch. There's not been a lot of playtesting. It is initially going to be a little bit less of a polished game. It's going to be a little bit silly, but it's also going to be a lot of fun. If you go into this game with a lot of expectations for yourself for rank and that you're going to grind to this rank and you're going to be the best ever, you're taking things the wrong way, especially at this point in the game's history. Let the game play itself out and develop and mature along the line, and you should with it. But in the meantime, just enjoy the game for what it is. Don't spoil the novelty and the grand fun that we're going to have with this game and its IP by forcing yourself that I'm only going to have fun if I'm actually ranking up and if my teammates are coordinating with me. We're all going to be learning this game together, and it's important to go into it from the right perspective and the right mindset. This is a pretty brief overview of a lot of really in detail concepts, but I do do think that taking and applying some of these concepts, whether it's playing your range, playing angles, timing things with your team, layering ultimates, mechanical habits, or anything like that, you're going to have a big edge over people that are kind of going in blind here. If you want to improve at any of these aspects, I highly recommend that you train these one at a time. Understanding them isn't good enough. Actually developing the skills is the most important thing, and that takes a lot of deliberate time, a lot of deliberate practice, and a lot of repetition. So don't watch this video and go in with a sense of expectation. Watch this video, get a couple of ideas, then go actually train those ideas and have a good time doing so. Ultimately, this video is only an edge if you actually deliberately train what's being said there. If there's anything that I can clarify, or if you have any questions about the concepts in this video, please let me know in the comments, and enjoy your play.